This is the Whole Care Network, helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to A Time to Care the Caregivers podcast. I'm your host, Isabel Melgarejo, and today with me, I have Kori Linn. Welcome, Kori Linn.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Kori Linn is a life coach. Probably everybody has the same question. What is the difference between a life coach and a therapist?
That's kind of a complex question because I do think there can be some overlap. And there are a lot of licensed therapists who do coaching as well, because that can allow them to serve people who are outside of the geographical area where they're licensed. For me, I think about if someone's coming to me when I'm trying to assess, like, am I a good fit to coach them, or would they be better served by a therapist? It's like kind of where are they at and what are the issues they want to deal with. If they're extremely burned out, like can't get off the couch, can't get out of bed, can't function, that's not going to be well suited to what I have expertise and knowledge in. I would say that's going to be someone who needs to be with a therapist. Or if they want to talk about their childhood or specifically like trauma, that's something I would say, okay, I think a licensed therapist who's trauma informed and, because there's a lot of different things that can mean to be a therapist and like different like specialties and levels of expertise. So I'd be looking for somebody with specifically that expertise. Whereas like I think a coach like me, and there's lots of kind of coaches too, but a coach like me is best suited to serve someone who is kind of doing okay or even doing well or really well, but they aren't getting to where they want to go, or they're having trouble with a goal, or they think they could be feeling more satisfied, or they're ready to make a change and they want skills, tools, and support to help them with that. So it's not a super cut and dried answer, but I think it really depends on like where you are and what kind of skills, support, and tools you're looking for that are going to help you get to where you want to go. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense for me. I've worked with coaches and therapists for different purposes in my life. One of the things that I like working with coaches with is about a lot of what you're doing in the present so you can impact your future. And I like that because sometimes you just need focus right now to change your life right now. And I want to ask you a question that a lot of my clients ask and people that I work with, which is how do you build boundaries? How do you create, like, obviously you, by building boundaries, you can go and Google it and you will have a lot of answers, but how do you prepare mentally for that kind of conversations?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Boundaries are so helpful, but I think for a lot of people, they're very difficult to deploy. And sometimes it's even difficult to understand, like, wait, what is a boundary versus what's a request, or like what's a suggestion, or even like what's a demand or an ultimatum. So I think the number one thing with boundaries is you have to remember that you're changing something, and change often feels uncomfortable. So if you're setting a limit or a preference or a rule where there didn't used to be one, you are probably going to feel uncomfortable in your body when you do that. You may feel shame, you may feel embarrassment, you may feel fear, you may feel anxiety, because there may be some level consciously or subconsciously where your brain's saying like you're not allowed to do that. that's against the rules, whether the rules are like from your family of origin or like the societal rules about like what it means to be a good person or a good friend, a good parent, a good wife, etc. So I think one of the keys to setting boundaries is distress tolerance. So that just really means like being able to handle the negative internal sensations of doing something new that feels a little like, oh, this might be dangerous. Like, I don't know how people are going to react. That's part of it. I think that's like not optional. You really have to figure that out. The other piece that's so important for setting boundaries is actually figuring out, like, well, where does it make sense for a boundary to be for me and what I want? And like, what is a boundary where I'm just going to either inform people or never inform them, but I just know what I'm going to do in a certain situation? And what's something where like I want to have a conversation, make a request, maybe like work with my spouse to have an agreement that's like verbal and out loud, and we're like all consenting to it. So a lot of people think a boundary is like what you do that's going to control other people. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can do that will actually control other people because they have free will. Also, kind of fortunately, right? Because I want to have free will and I don't want to be controlled by other people. So it's not ever going to, it's not going to make your boss stop emailing you at 3 a.m. So the boundary is for you and it's what you're going to do, which could be like turn your notifications off and not answer until 9 a.m. So that I think that's also part of what's important to understand about boundaries is they're for you. They're not, you can tell other people about them, but it doesn't necessarily mean other people will follow them like a set of rules.
I love that because a lot of the people that I work with, they have issues at saying no to their loved ones. They feel that they have to say yes, but knowing that they just can't skip the conversation and maybe don't do it. Like if someone's asking for them for a specific particular thing to do, they can just not do it. And I think a lot about my mom because she's always been very well-tempered, and everybody thinks that she's very accommodating of everybody. But the truth is that she has very good boundaries, and she knows what she's going to do and what she's not. And there's a point in life in which she just says yes to everything, and then she does whatever she feels like doing.
That's certainly one way to approach it. It depends on who you are and like what feels good to you. For me, I would rather have the difficult conversation because it would be so uncomfortable if I said yes and then didn't do it and then the person circled back. Now, like the reality is a lot of people won't circle back, but this is like just part of my personality and it's like one of the things that I'm like, ooh, I would rather just have the uncomfortable difficult conversation now than have it later and then have to add on top of the difficulty that like I didn't do what I said I would do. But I think it really comes down person to person. But one tip that I have heard before that I think is really useful is if you always say yes, but you want to say no, you can just start by saying maybe. You can start by saying, let me think about that because it's softer than a no, but it's not a yes. And it kind of implies like, well, it doesn't imply. It's like you saying, I need more time. I'm going to like look at my calendar, and then you can kind of go away and without the pressure of the other person, really kind of figure out like, do I want to do that? Am I willing to do that? And if I'm not willing to do it, now you have more time and like privacy to formulate how you're going to say that. Because I think a lot of times when someone asks us for something, we feel kind of, like we're like, oh, I'm put on the spot. I'm trapped. And now I just have to like either say yes or say no. And I think one of the things that coaching has really taught me and that it teaches a lot of my clients is like there's usually more options than the two that our brain is like, these are the ones, right? So being able to say like maybe or let me think about that is a third option. And then you could choose like your mom just to not circle back. Or you could choose to be like, you know what, I'm going to close the loop on this because it feels good and aligned and powerful to me to do that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I find it so good when you're able just to decide and be able to have that power on you. So, how do you relate having these boundaries with being burnout or overwhelmed all the time?
Well, I think the way that boundaries and burnout relate is the less boundaries you have, probably the more burnout you're going to have. And the more boundaries you have, probably the less burnout you're going to have. Now, it's not a one to one because boundaries are not the only factor. According to science, there's like 6 risk factors for burnout. One of them's like workload. If you have an unsustainable workload, that is a risk factor for burnout. One of them is perceived lack of control. One of them is reward, like both the intrinsic and extrinsic rewards for the labor, whatever it is. One is a sense of community. One is a sense of fairness. And one is whether your values are a good match for the situation or not. So burnout is complex and there are different aspects of it. But when you think about that first factor, which is workload, if you feel uncomfortable setting boundaries and you accept every request that someone, gives, then that could very quickly become an unsustainable workload. And workload is obviously not just for work, in a professional paid capacity. Like women do so much more emotional and other kinds of unpaid labor generally. And so it could be all different kinds of workload that is unsustainable. And boundaries can also, I think, impact some of the other pieces as well, right? Like if you don't have sufficient rewards for you to feel satisfied, setting boundaries about like what kind of work you're willing to do or in what capacity could be a way that maybe you could bring the reward back in balance. Or if you think about like one of the factors is fairness, if you're doing too much and the distribution of labor is unfair, boundaries can help you bring that back into something that's more workable for you.
How do you start segregating this kind of mental mess? Like, I just think about it like when you're burnout, you have all of these thoughts in your head. And a lot of times I feel, and when I've been burnout in the past, I feel that I'm just stuck in life and
Mm.
you can't just flow with life. So what are the first things that you do to start untangling that knot in your head to keep flowing and to keep moving forward with whatever your goals, aspirations are?
Well, this is going to sound obnoxious, but I think the best thing you can do is stay out of burnout, right? Obviously, we're going to talk about what to do if you're in burnout, but if you if something's not working for you or you like it's wearing on you or you sense burnout is looming, as early as possible is the best time to address that because the deeper you go into burnout, the harder it is to get back out. Because the further in you go, the more exhausted you are, the more overwhelmed you are, the more unsettled you are, the more, despairing even or hopeless. I just think it's really important to say as soon as possible it's like preventative medicine, right? It's like the earlier you can see and address something, the easier it's going to be to address and the better your quality of life is going to be for the duration. That being said, if you're in burnout, you're probably exhausted and overwhelmed, right? And like all those other things I said. So I think it's starting really small because that might be all you have energy for. And I think it's like looking around for either like what's the easiest changes I can begin to make that are going to improve my quality of life and help me feel better. And we're just going to start with those because they're the easiest. Or as like looking around and going, well, what's the most impactful? Because, we want to get to feeling better as soon as we can. And there's a lot of different things at play with burnout. So it's not like I can just say, well, just like do this one thing and it'll solve everything. If you are super burned out, if you're able to take some kind of a leave and then dedicate more of your time and energy to getting out of that burnout, that can be really helpful. I've seen clients take leave from work very successfully and it's been so useful because it gives them, again, so much time and energy back to focus on that. If you don't have access to that, I think that the key things are going to be setting boundaries, managing expectations, and maintaining a useful mental narrative, which basically means sometimes when we're in a bad situation or things aren't going well, we can kind of get in this bad echo chamber in our head about how bad it is. And that in and of itself can kind of like wear us down and make us feel hopeless and make things seem even worse and even more disempowering. And if anyone wants a deep dive on that, I have a whole podcast episode that walks through those three things. It's called something like How to Stay Sane in a Not So Great Workplace. It just came out a couple weeks ago on the Satisfied AF podcast. But those three things are going to help move the needle forward. And a lot of people are already trying to do 1 and 2, but they're like, oh, building a useful mental narrative, especially because not everyone knows the human brain has a negativity bias. So it tends to focus on and obsess about the things that aren't working. And it tends to diminish or even ignore the things that are working. And that's kind of a recipe for feeling bad. So getting out from under that can help a lot. But again, also starting small and celebrating where you are starting and the little moves you're making, because everything big and beautiful is made of a bunch of tiny little moves. And also moving in a new direction, like going against whatever has become habitual or been what you're used to, that's really hard. Like we talked about with setting boundaries at all, it often feels really uncomfortable to do things a different way. And I think it's so helpful when you can, notice and praise the fact that you're moving in a new direction and trying something. That can sound really silly to people like, well, why should I praise myself for doing this thing that's like helping me that I probably should have been doing all along? But I think when we notice and celebrate ourselves, it's like whatever we celebrate, we're probably going to do more of. And so that can help build, a positive association with those little micro changes that adding up will change your whole life.
Yesterday I was in I wouldn't say conference, but I was in a talk about aligning yourself and something like that. I don't remember the name of the talk, but it was about that. The speaker, she was talking about celebrating as well. And one of the things that came out for me is that I usually celebrate or praise myself with food. One of the things that came is like, what else can I do for myself? Like, there must be something else besides eating a delicious dessert. So I don't know if you can give ideas about that.
Well, first of all, I don't think you're alone in that. I think food is a way that a lot of people celebrate. I'm a big fan of eating as well, but I agree that sometimes it's not what we want to be our only option. So I think a way that can be really helpful is words of affirmation, right? From yourself to yourself. And I think that's something a lot of people don't think about because it can feel kind of weird and awkward to affirm yourself. But affirming yourself like out loud or written down is really also you practicing new neural pathways of positive self regard and kind of like reinforcing to your brain that like this thing you did is meaningful and valuable and like kind of identifying yourself as someone who, achieves her goals, as someone who does what she says she'll do, that kind of stuff can be very, I think, reinforcing and fun, right? Because a lot of us have pretty negative self talk sometimes. So I think there's also lots of other things you can do that are like sensory, right? So eating is definitely a sensory activity, but so is lighting a candle that smells incredible or listening to the wind rustle in the trees. That might not be like what you first think of when you're like, how am I going to celebrate? But like I personally love the sound of wind rustling in the trees, right? Or like if you really like to be in nature, right? You could take a trip to be in a beautiful forest. That could be a way to celebrate. That is like, travel, but it's also, sensory. Something I like to have my clients do sometime is just like ask themselves, like, how do you like to be celebrated? Like, how do you like to be recognized? How do you want to be admired? And I think that's not something a lot of us think about, but kind of doing that as a little journaling activity could reveal to you like different ways that might feel good for you.
I love it. This question just came out for me yesterday, and I was like, I'm in a part in the journey that I want to start eating healthier and not just eating whatever I feel like eating, but actually paying attention to what feels good in my body. The soul food sometimes doesn't make me feel great. So having other options is always great. And I agree, like just celebrating every day. Do you have any practice or recommendations like for daily use in terms of celebrating or just filling your cup a little bit more every day?
Well, for me, it's journaling, it's writing, right? It's making lists of like, well, here's, something that was a goal of mine that I achieved and kind of spending time being present with that Because again, the brain tends to want to go, oh, well, the whole these 6 things aren't working. So we need to only think about them and don't think about that thing that worked out. Cause like maybe that was a fluke or you should have been doing it anyways. So kind of like moving into that more positive mental headspace and trying to physically call up in my body the sensation of joy, the sensation of gratitude, and the sensation of satisfaction. Like, what does it feel like to be satisfied on an emotional, physiological level and kind of spend more time in that? So for me, I'm a very verbal, language oriented person. So a lot of it is going to be language, right? You can also create like, a note in your notes app of like your wins and the things that you've done that are impressive achievements or even little tiny achievements that feel so good to you. And then you can go review that when you kind of want to reinforce to yourself, like, look at all this stuff I've done. I think it can also be things like a dance party, right? I thought of that after we did the list already, but I also think it can be highly personalized. So there might be a way that someone else celebrates that would just like never occur to me to celebrate. Or like I am a person who drinks alcohol. So I think for a lot of people, like eating as a celebration or drinking as a celebration, it's kind of like, oh, because those behaviors sometimes we can go overboard in them, or like maybe we don't want to be like, oh, this is the only way like I show myself I did a good job. But I personally do like champagne and I like to have a glass of champagne sometimes when, I want to celebrate myself or acknowledge an achievement.
And I think there's different sorts of celebrations. You can celebrate yourself every day for little wins. One of the things that I've been working on right now is start to like a gratitude journal and see how that feels and see how I connect with the spiritual side of myself. I don't know how this is going to end. This is something that I'm just investigating for myself and how it feels. When creating these habits and just celebrating them, celebrate that you did the thing, even if it was a small win. For me, it was getting to start this practice, it was getting a journal and a pen next to my bed. So before going to bed, I would have 5 minutes to write down what I was grateful for and why. I would celebrate myself. But so those are small wins that you usually celebrate every day. And then you have big wins that probably you celebrate it with more enthusiasm. So I became a US citizen last week, and after I passed the exam, I decided to make a huge celebration because that was like for me a huge step in since I moved to the US, going through all of these processes and things to do and a lot of interviews and a very long night after I received a notice the day after I had to go to whatever appointment. So
Congratulations. That
thank
is a
you.
big deal. So what was your big celebration?
So I invited friends over and I had catering coming in and tons of drinks, tons of food, amazing food. As I mentioned, like for me, food is a way to celebrate, and sharing with others is like the way I just amplify that,
Mm,
sharing with others some highlights in my life.
sounds like a really fun time.
It was. I think for a lot of people, we just wait for the big events to celebrate. We don't necessarily celebrate the small things. I really like this and just having different options to celebrate different things and maybe you get champagne when you have a big win or a middle win and you can have I don't know, a spritz of water. You're celebrating small.
So I think one of the things is that people crave satisfaction. Like they want that sense of like feeling good about themselves and like the celebration. I think they really are hungry for it. But I think a lot of times people don't give themselves permission to have it. They put it off until a big win. But even then, when a big win comes, sometimes like they don't actually have very much capacity to hold that sensation of satisfaction and to like really enjoy it. So I'm a big fan of practicing feeling satisfaction every day so that when something bigger comes along, like you have that habit, you have an ability to be with it. Like it might sound silly that people would struggle to be with a positive emotion, but for a lot of people, it is a struggle. It's either like, well, now the other shoe's going to drop, or it doesn't feel safe, or it feels like bragging. So I definitely think it's an interesting thing and not as straightforward as it might seem like it is.
So how do you practice feeling all of the feelings? Because I know it can be very uncomfortable, or at least it is for me sometimes.
Yeah, I think feelings are really uncomfortable for a lot of people, honestly, because I don't think many of us get like an education as a child about like, okay, now you're feeling a feeling. That's information. It's like a biological cascade and it has, sense in your physical body. Like it has sensations in your physical body, right? And so I think a lot of us are like, ooh, a feeling. And then we're like, get it away from me, right? And then we distract ourselves with scrolling TikTok or, having a slice of cake or, going and talking on the phone to our friend or doing work or whatever. And I think the way that we experience feelings is to tune into the physical sensations of them and be curious about those and allow them to like do their experience and then pass. Now, that being said, there are some people, like if you've experienced trauma, it might feel too dangerous to feel your physical feelings. Not that it's dangerous in a literal way, but the body is not always safe for everyone, depending on their previous experiences. So if you are like, I'm not going to try that, I totally get that. But if you feel like it's an okay thing for you to do, that's what you can do. And I love to view feelings just as information, right? Like if I have anger, that's like some spicy information. Like something has bothered me and I want to like look at what it is. And if I have sadness, that's a different kind of information. Like I feel tender about something. What is it? And I think when you kind of build that like curiosity and relationship with your feelings, they can be really interesting and be so revealing about like what matters to you and what really matters to you living a life that's going to feel good for you.
I love that. Paying attention to the feelings to know what's important to you. I love that. That analogy of determining what is good, what feels good. Is there anything else you want to add to this conversation for people out there?
Yeah, I would also say it can be helpful to have the lens of stress responses as well. So we have stress responses all the time to things in life. And sometimes the way you're going to experience a stress response is going to be as an emotion, right? So if you think about anger, you can think about it like I just said, spicy information. You can also think like, oh, this is like a fight reaction. Like I'm angry, I want to fight something. What feels threatened that has brought that sensation up? If you are feeling afraid, want to run away, like, oh, maybe I'm in a stress response of flight. What feels threatened that my body is trying to solve by like leaving the situation? And that can be really helpful because it can just give another layer of like understanding to like what's actually going on there. And sometimes, like if you have a fight response, if you get that spicy information, you might be like, oh, this thing that just happened is not okay with me. There needs to be a boundary here. But sometimes what's also happened with me is I'm like, oh, it's not that this thing that's happening here is actually threatening to me, but the way I'm thinking about it or the way I've interpreted it is threatening to me. And it's like sometimes you want to change that external circumstance, and sometimes it's revealing that you're like, oh, I think I want to change the thing that's actually happening inside my own brain and the way that my brain's like interpreting that as dangerous. And like not to like, be mad at yourself, even just be like, oh, I don't know if that's like what I want to have happen. So like maybe we're gonna do some revising, which is like what coaching is a lot, is like walking people through like your stress responses, your feelings, your burnout, and looking at like where are we going to put boundaries, where do we need to, rebuild the mental narrative and all of that stuff so you can have more of the experience you want.
I love that. So, if people are interested in working with you, how can they reach out?
People can find me on Instagram at Kori Linn, KoriLinn. You can also find me at KoriLinn.com. I'm on TikTok at the Kori Linn, and I'm on LinkedIn under my name, Kori Linn. And so you can contact me via any of those, or you can email me, Kori at KoriLinn.com. I would love to hear from you and hear what's going on. and how we can get you feeling satisfied AF because you deserve nothing less.
I love it. And you also have a podcast. So if people are interested in listening to that, we're going to put that in the show notes as well.
That's right. I forgot to list that one, but I do have the Satisfied AF podcast, which is in basically all the podcast places, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and also on YouTube.
Thank you so much, Kori, for coming here, for sharing all your knowledge, which is every time that I talk with you, it's a lot. Like you give me so many things to think about, and I love it all the time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.